At the time of the Great War, Newfoundland was not a part of Canada. It was a separate British Dominion. Most of us today think of Newfoundland as in that extreme eastern part of Canada, but at the time it wasn't. And Newfoundland, here at the Somme, as a percentage of men involved, probably suffered the worst. We're standing in the Newfoundland Memorial Park. It is by far the best preserved part of the Somme battlefield, probably one of the best preserved sites on the entire Western Front. You can come here, and in the midst of the Somme River Valley, where you have miles and miles of flat farmland, where in 1916 there were trenches that ran all the way from the channel down to the border with Switzerland. Most of those trenches are gone now. Most of the evidence, other than the cemeteries, most of the evidence that there was ever one of the worst battles in human history here is gone. But here, on I think 70 acres, it's completely preserved. You can see the trenches where the Newfoundlanders were coming out of the trenches to fight. You can actually go across and see the German trenches, and you can better than anywhere else on this battlefield really get an understanding of exactly where everyone was and where the enemy was, and vice versa. And there are even some cemeteries on this property. So we're just going to look around a little bit and talk a little bit about what happened on this site. I know it's difficult to imagine, but these trenches, I know for all of us they define the war, but I don't think we fully understand what life was like here. Yes, there was the mud and the rain and the dirt and the difficult conditions, but the men were in these trenches for weeks, sometimes for months. Sometimes when the shelling got real bad, they couldn't leave. Especially early on in the war, before they were extended and other places were made, men were going to the bathroom in these trenches. They would often use helmets to go to the bathroom in, and then they would dump them over the side as far away from the trench as they could. But you can only do that so much. Often men died in these trenches and they couldn't go out to bury them, and so they buried them in the trench. You were walking over top of your comrades' graves, and you knew that if you were killed, that's where you were going to end up. There are descriptions by the soldiers of just the mass of thousands of flies that would descend on them in the trenches because of the bodies, because of the smell, because of all of the various things that you can imagine. You had to eat there, you had to sleep there, you lived there. You weren't showering, you weren't in a bed, you weren't particularly warm, especially at this time of year. It was take your worst nightmare and multiply it by 10, and then add the drum roll of artillery fire from huge guns, just boom, 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 all the time. Honestly, to me, in studying all of history, if there's one war I would not want to be a soldier in, it was this one. And it's because of that. It's because of the artillery. It's because of the conditions. I just honestly don't know that there's ever been anything like it. As in other places on the battlefield, there was a week-long bombardment of the German position. The German position was off in the distance there. It's an area known as Y, Ravine. It's one of the few places on the battlefield where the Germans were actually in a lower position than the British and Commonwealth forces were. Typically they were attacking uphill. But in this case, there's kind of a natural fortification with that ravine. And so the Germans were dug in well there, and it protected them from the artillery, as was the case in most places. And so when the Newfoundlanders rose up to attack, they began to attack over open ground. And you can see just behind me, the main line is about where that monument is. It's probably 100 yards away. And where I'm standing now is about as far as most of them got. Right behind me here are the petrified remains of what is known as the danger tree. It's called the danger tree because this kind of marks the middle of no man's land. It marks the spot that is as far as most of them got, because what happened was right down here, you can see where the ground dips. And so there was this kind of natural dip that if you look across at where the Germans were, I'm right at about the same level as the Germans right now. And so if you dip down, I guess the thought was that the machine gunners could not hit you down there. And that offered some protection. So a lot of men aimed for this position to try and get here, to get down to that position, to get away from the gunfire. But of course, that just meant that a lot of bodies piled up in this area as they all huddled toward the same spot. The casualties were severe. The 1st Battalion suffered 86% casualties on this field. 86%. When we talk about the American Civil War, the gold standard for worst casualties is typically the 26th North Carolina at Gettysburg, who suffered around 80%. The 1st Minnesota was right around that same area, about 80%, but 86%. There were 700 casualties. There were less than 70 men that were available for roll call the next morning. I mean, those are just almost impossible to believe numbers. There were 14 sets of brothers who were killed on this field. 4 lieutenants from the same family died here. When you talk to the people of Newfoundland, this is the place. In all of their history, this is the place that is remembered. This is the place that is honored. It's one of, I think, only 2 places outside of Canada that are Canadian national memorials, national monuments. This is a place of great honor, but also a place of great horror for the people of Newfoundland. The commander of the 29th Division, whose men were attacking here, would go on to say after the battle that it was a magnificent display of valor by these men, and it only failed because dead men can advance no further. That kind of sums it up. This is one of a couple of cemeteries here. This is the Ravine Cemetery, and as with other cemeteries, you'll see a lot of July dates and then a lot of November dates, and that indicates that second major attack that happened that took a lot of the ground that they failed to take in July. Interesting to note that in addition to the Newfoundlanders and the Highlanders of Scotland, the 51st Division, who fought here, there are also a lot of South Wales borderers. And if you're familiar at all with the British Army, you may recognize that name. The South Wales borderers were the same regiment, I think it's the 24th Regiment of Foot, that fought in the Zulu War at places like Islan Luana and Rorke's Drift. Those were the South Wales borderers. As one who loves history, I really appreciate this monument. It says, "Scotland, by this monument in the land of her ancient ally and comrade in arms, commemorates those officers and men of the 51st Highland Division who fell in the Great War." The alliance between France and Scotland in the years before Scotland and England were united under one crown was known as the Old Alliance, AULD Alliance. And it was one of the things that helped keep Scotland independent for so long, because she knew she could count on France as an ally to keep England in check from coming and gobbling them back up again. And it was only when Queen Elizabeth passed away in the early part of the 17th century that the throne passed to her cousin, who was the King of Scotland, King James VI, who became King James I of England, and the two became united under one crown and eventually united as the island of Great Britain, and then later the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. So there are a lot of stories that come out of the Great War, a lot of lore, a lot of history that gave a lot of units their identities. For example, the United States Marine Corps at Belleau Wood, and the nickname that they came out of the Great War with, the Devil Dogs. And there was always the story that they had been named devil dogs by the Germans because of how they fought, but the fact was that that was a name that probably was given to them by Americans. It appeared in print in the United States long before they went into action in the Great War. There's a similar story that I actually wanted to do an entire video about, and it was going to be titled "The Ladies from Hell," about the 51st Highland Division. But as I started doing research into this story, I found out the truth. So the Highlanders wore kilts, and the Germans called them skirts. That part is true. They didn't really understand that culture, that part of Scottish heritage, which really doesn't go back all that far. It certainly doesn't go back to the time of William Wallace, but it is a part of Scottish heritage. And so when these Highlanders showed up fighting that way, the story goes that because of the way that they fought, the Germans nicknamed them the Ladies from Hell. But nothing could be further from the truth. The Germans, probably more than any other army on the Western Front, their soldiers kept diaries, a lot of them, and we have a lot of those. Not a single German soldier ever refers to the Highlanders that way in any of their writings. All of the sources we have that call the Highlanders the Ladies from Hell are on the Allied side. So it's a cool story. And it's kind of neat to think about the Germans calling them that and then seeing how viciously they fought, despite the fact they were wearing skirts as the Germans thought them to be. But the fact is that it's just really kind of a propaganda thing more than anything. But that doesn't take away from how incredibly well these men fought, men such as the Black Watch. And is there a better name for a unit anywhere in the world than the Black Watch? I absolutely love that, and that's a unit that I plan to do a lot more research into before my next trip here. But you have the Gordon Highlanders, and of course you have the PALS battalions from places like Edinburgh and Glasgow, who all fought just incredibly well on these fields. Here's something I've talked about some on the channel. You can see the red sign. They call these red zones for a reason. You have to imagine that in places like the Somme, Verdun, other places along the line, there were literally millions of artillery shells that were fired. Some estimates are as high as a third, but certainly as at least a fifth, somewhere between a fifth and a third of all of those artillery shells that were fired were duds. They didn't explode, which means that there are literally millions of unexploded rounds that were laying all over these battlefields, and many of them are still there. And I don't know what the rate is or how often it happens, but I know people continue to die because of the Great War, because every so often someone encounters one of those unexploded shells and they don't know what it is, or they don't know what to do with it, or they mishandle it, and it goes off and they end up killed. The French army will gather those up. There are places where farmers, for example, when they're plowing their fields and they dig up some of this unexploded ordnance, they'll place them in a pile on the side of the road, and the French army will come around for what they call the iron harvest and gather up what has been harvested that year by the farmers. It's a continual problem, and it's something, you know, as an American, the only war that was really fought on our soil was the Civil War in any large numbers, and even the American Civil War. I mean, there was the Revolution, but it was so small in scale even compared to the Civil War. But the Civil War is dwarfed in comparison to what happened on the Western Front in World War I. And then, of course, they had World War II fought here as well. And so these people live on battlefields that literally can kill them. It's an ongoing issue. So just once again, I want to kind of put in perspective this attack. Just in front of the statue over there, you can see kind of the build-up area where the frontline trenches are for the British. I'm maybe 100 yards away from there now, which puts me right in line with the danger tree. So 100 yards is about as far as most of them ever made it. Now over there, just in front of those trees, is the German frontline trenches. It's probably 300 yards away. It's, I don't know, it's sad, it makes me angry, it's frustrating, but it's not unique to here. That was the way it was all along the lines. And who's to blame for that? Well, you know, a lot of people, the popular thing to do is to blame the generals. In particular, men like General Sir Henry Rawlinson, who was in command of the army who fought here. But the Somme is hardly unique in that. There were plenty of attacks where everyone thought the artillery softened up the target, only to find out that it didn't. I think it's the scale of this attack and the scale of the number of dead. 19,000 British soldiers killed in the first day, most of them within a couple of hours, that people tend to point to about this place. But that wasn't even the greatest loss of life for an army in one day during the Western Front. The French lost more than that in one day back in the early months of the war. I think they lost over 20,000 killed in one day. But for the collective British memory, for the Canadians, for the Scottish, for the Australians and the New Zealanders and the South Africans and the Irish and the men from India and all of these other places, the Somme and Ypres, especially Passchendaele, which was, I think, the third battle of Ypres, those become the things that are in the collective memory as the horrors of the Western Front. And it's hard to get a picture of that today because it's so peaceful and it's so quiet. But when you start to see the cemeteries everywhere, then you start to understand. This was not a place anybody would want to be. And I do this because I want their stories to be told. It's been 100 years, and honestly, I don't think that many people, even people who are interested in history, know a whole lot about the Great War. And I think it was the defining war of the 20th century, not World War II, not Korea, not Vietnam, not Afghanistan, not any of these other places where various nations fought. And I mean the Soviets in Afghanistan, not America, before you send me a message that wasn't the 20th century. It was here. This was the defining moment of the 20th century and probably one of the defining moments of world history. And I wish more people knew about it.